Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. Today's guest is Martin Reeves, author of The Imagination Machine. Martin, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Nice to be here.
And you're in Norway right now, correct?
Yes, I am. Final couple of meetings of the year, and then I'm going to take a break.
Well, we're just glad you were able to take the time to speak with us. And usually our show is on Friday, but because Friday is Christmas Eve, we are having the show today. So we're thrilled to have you participate. So let's start with you telling us a little bit about your professional background.
I started off wanting to be a musician. That didn't work out. I went into biophysics, studied that in Cambridge in the UK and in Tokyo. And the employment prospects were not so great there. So I went into consulting and really liked it, actually. I really like problem solving. So that's where I stuck. I've worked with BCG in many continents, and now I run research for BCG. I run our think tank, the Henderson Institute, which comes up with the next set of ideas that managers and leaders will need, including the one we're talking about today.
Is this your first book?
No, I've written a bunch of strategy books, basically. I've written a book called Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, about meta strategy. It's about how do you know what sort of strategy you need, not just what is your strategy. And I've written a book on adaptive advantage. How do organizations adapt to changing conditions? And I've written a book about evidence-based change. How can we use data to inform change, which doesn't work very well. So I've written, I think, 6 in total.
Wow, congratulations. So tell us a little bit about this book and why did you write
it? I guess I noticed as a practicing strategist that over the years that even if you take a bunch of smart people, you give them a lot of time, you give them the right resources, you can't really stretch your strategy unless you first stretch your mind. So I got interested in stretching the mind. So I used to do a series of what I call pre-strategy games, which is, opening up the mind before you enter the formal strategy process. And then I started to think about this some more, and it struck me that the creative side of the strategy, the imaginative side of strategy, wasn't very well documented. And so this idea of mind-stretching games morphed into a book about the imagination. And I looked and couldn't find the sort of book I wanted to write, which is essentially a handbook of how to harness collective imagination. So I set about it with my co-author.
Well, I have to tell you, the book was terrific, and one that you just can't kind of put down, and also one you have to read a couple of times to get all the good information. So let's start off with, how do you define imagination as it relates to the business world?
Well, the book technically is not about imagination, it's about harnessing imagination.
Yeah.
So it's more than imagination. So I define harnessing imagination as the ability to think about things which don't exist, but could exist, and then making them exist. So creating new realities, if you will. And that's where the title of the book comes from, the Imagination Machine, because it sounds like a strange idea, the imagination machine, but if you think about what companies do over long sweeps of time, they take ideas for things that don't exist in the world, and then they create new realities by realizing those fantasies or those ideas. So I wanted to know, how does that process work and how can we tame it a little?
You list 5 misconceptions about imagination. What are they?
Well, they all come from the Romantic period, actually. So we have this idea of the tragic genius, the genius waiting for the moment of divine inspiration, staring at the clouds and waiting for the big idea. And so that's given us the idea that imagination is individual. It's a special gift given to only certain individuals. It couldn't possibly be harnessed systematically because it's very complicated and very frisky. But actually, the more I thought about that seems rather strange, because we don't shy away as companies from thinking about things like consumer psychology or team composition or team motivation, which are also very human and very complicated. So it struck me as I started to read about the science of imagination, that really there was no reason why we couldn't have a handbook of collective imagination.
How how has the pandemic affected the way companies and entrepreneurs imagine and create new products and services?
Well, one myth of a crisis, I've spent a lot of time thinking about crisis strategy and doing big data analysis of what happens during a crisis. One of the myths about a crisis is that it's a cyclical deviation from a norm. So in other words, it returns back to how it was before the crisis, but that is almost never the case. The world changes. So when the world changes, that means new needs, and we can serve needs passively. We can ask consumers what they want and do what they tell us, or we can imagine new ways of pleasing them. So this particular pandemic, it was the fastest recession in recent history. It was the fastest recovery in recent history, and it dramatically accelerated underlying trends. Things like concern for family, concern for health, telemedicine, teleeducation, digital supply chains, digital commerce. So all of that created a lot of opportunities to reimagine. And in fact, every previous crisis we've looked at actually increases what we call the competitive spread, the difference between the performance of the best and the worst companies. And this one did too. So there really are some winners from COVID, the ones that were proactive about seizing the opportunity to reimagine their business.
Was there anything that surprised you? Like, was there a company that sprang up or an older company that made a pivot that you said, boy, they must have read my book?
Well, we wrote a paper called The Winners and Losers in COVID, and every company has its particular details, but the broad trend is actually pretty much the same across all of these winning companies, and that is that they were never in a completely monoculture business. They always had diversity in their portfolio. And in biology, there's this thing called pre-adaptation, which means that you don't wait until you need a wing to make a wing. You already have something that can become a wing. You're pre-adapted because you have diversity in your portfolio. All of these companies had diversity. All of them were very interested in figuring out what was going on, and all of them reallocated resources to new sources of growth. So that's basically what all of these companies did. Now, if there was a surprise, it was healthcare and education to me, because strategists like to write books about better ways of structuring education and healthcare, but they're the most conservative industries on earth, and there are many false prophets. But actually, in this crisis, there were substantial cracks in the model of even the conservative industries in healthcare and education, mainly to do with remote learning, but also to do with, for instance, vaccine registration and development timelines. A lot of things change in those industries where not much usually changes.
How about BCG? What was the big change for you guys from this?
Well, I know the strategy part of BCG very well, and I think with this imagination book and with companies wanting to accelerate out of the crisis, we did a lot of interesting work on pattern detection as to how was the world changing and what were the new opportunities. It's actually a very exciting time of crisis. It's a crisis in some ways demands what you might call psychologically counter-cyclical strategy. In other words, as Warren Buffett says, when be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy. At the very time when other companies are battening down the hatches is actually the best time to leapfrog your competitors. So that's what we spent a lot of time thinking about during the COVID period on strategy.
What were most of your clients asking you for, especially in the beginning of the pandemic when nobody was really sure? What was the advice that they were seeking?
Well, that's actually was the core of my job during COVID, because I guess my little research unit, one of its jobs is to jump on new and not very well understood opportunities, things like Brexit happening or COVID, and to get a point of view out there very quickly. And I think the hallmark of this crisis was that those topics change very quickly. So at the beginning of the crisis, it was a very, very fast moving crisis because viruses replicate very quickly. So every time you thought you'd understood something else happened. So at the very beginning, it was it was just, what's going on? Tell us about COVID. What are the medical effects? What are the economic effects? What are the social effects? There was a rapid learning agenda. Then that became more about reactive strategy, which is, well, what can we do to preserve viability and performance? And then it became adaptive strategy. This thing looks like it continues to evolve. So how do we make sure we're flexible and resilient in the face of ongoing change? And then eventually that gives way to creative strategy, which is actually shaping circumstances and new offerings and imagining new offerings. So it's the multiple timescales of resilience, really. It starts with anticipation, then goes to reaction, and then goes to adaptation, and eventually gets to opportunity. I call it the race to optimism. Some companies, as soon as there's a crisis, see opportunity. Others never see opportunity. They just see it as something to be coped with.
So did your recruiting change at BCG? And I taught at Wharton for 10 years. So either my students went to McKinsey or they went to BCG. And so did it change
Not
the
really.
kind of people you're recruiting?
No, because the thing is, there's a huge time lag in our recruiting, right? We recruit for people becoming seasoned consultants 2 years out, project leaders 4 years out, managers 6 years out, partners 8 or 10 years out. So actually you can't overreact. So we try not to touch the accelerator and the brake too much during the crisis. I think that's something the company has learned over its history. We were founded in the early 60s, and I think we learned the thing about this business is you have to think in terms of these talent development lags. The other thing is the competition for talent is very intense. So you've got to think about the effects not only on your pipeline, but on your reputation with business schools and the other places we recruit. So for that reason, we didn't overreact on the recruiting front.
So in the book, you talk about types of things that spur creativity. What are some of those things?
Well, the neuroscience of imagination says that one of the unique things about human beings is that we have mental models in our head that are more than just passive perception. We don't just see something, we have a model of how something works in our head. And we tend to change that when we encounter surprise. So the inspiration for imagination comes from surprise. So therefore we have to be surprise seeking in order to imagine. And that may sound pretty straightforward, but one of the things we know about large companies is that they become more introverted the bigger they become. It's a bit like a sphere. The larger the radius of the sphere, the lower the ratio of the surface area to the volume. So by default, companies become more and more inward looking, and they don't see the change, the particulars, the surprises, which are the inspiration for imagination. Now, some companies lean against that, and so they do see the imagination. They do see the imaginative surprises. Reflection time is another big thing that you need to imagine. And in Anglo-Saxon business, particularly, the utilization rates, people work so hard and so intensely and so continuously. There's no time for reflection. So that's probably great for execution, but it's really not good for the reflection required for imagination. Counterfactual thinking skills. So if you're trying to think about something that doesn't exist that could exist, that's a very special type of thinking. It has its own discipline, its own tools. Most of us were not taught that since kindergarten. So that's places that teach and cultivate that's conducive to imagination. And the avoidance of the two things that will kill imagination stone dead. One of them is fear. You live in a very pressured environment where there's a huge pressure not to fail and an implicit punishment for failure. You will not dare to imagine anything new. And the other one is complacency. Interestingly, one of the paradoxes of imagination is that if you're successful in changing the world, as our founder Bruce Henderson said, you're likely to become a prisoner of the assumptions which underpin your past successful business model. So constantly questioning the basis for your success and staying humble and hungry, all of these things are conducive to imagination.
Funny, when you talked about reflective, I worked for the chairman and CEO of Senecor, a guy named Dr. Hubert Schumacher, who built Senecor and then sold it for $4.2 billion. And he had me spend one day a week, usually Friday, just reflecting. He said, I want you to do nothing, no sales calls, nothing. I just want you to spend a day reflecting. This went on for a good year. That's all he wanted me to do. He said, you got a creative mind. I want you to think about new ideas that you could do with this organization that I was running on his behalf. So I thought that was pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
sounds like a wise leader. Yeah, to me, time management doesn't mean squeezing more into my schedule. It actually means not titrating myself to 100% efficiency, leaving these blocks for reflection. So in my calendar, I have my assistant's schedule what I call thinking time, and I use it for reading, thinking. It's for more reflective work, and I need 3 or more 2 or 3 hour blocks per week. Otherwise, eventually, I just dry up. I stop having new ideas.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and people need to spend that time to do it. Do you find that CEOs of entrepreneurial companies, ones who founded the company, are more are more pushing for that kind of thinking, as opposed to people, let's say, they rose up through the ranks, they might have come from finance, and then because they have such good financial skills, they end up being the CEO. They're really good at sales, and they end up in those roles. Do you find, is there a difference?
Yes. Well, one of the fun things about the book is I got to speak to entrepreneurs, people that started companies that had, essentially built an imagination machine, and large companies that wanted to do so. And one of the common denominators of all of the entrepreneurs that I spoke to is that they all had their own words for it, but as one of them put it, they're very afraid of the death of curiosity. So in other words, when they found a company, they were hand to mouth. They never took their success for granted. They realized they could run out of cash in a matter of weeks. And they were constantly questioning and evolving their model. If they find success, and of course, 95% of startups fail, but if they do find a measure of success and they start hiring the next generation of employees, those employees are prone to thinking, okay, I'm joining a sure thing. I'm joining a company where they've got everything figured out. And the entrepreneurs I spoke to said, it's so important to communicate to the recruits that is not the case. We want them to continue to be curious and to question. Yes, and by the other end of the spectrum, I guess it, if you're working in finance for a relatively stable industry, then you might have seen, a continuous situation, a continuity of a business model or something. So your main obsession is with the efficiency rather than reinvention. But I think that's rather dangerous in today's business environment. So one of my conclusions from the book is that reimagination is the new execution. And I sort of have numerical proof of that, because I looked at something called the competitive fade rate, which is the rate at which competitive advantage fades. And it's about 10 times faster than it was in 1990, which means that most companies need in the business of constantly reinventing themselves. So execution against a stable plan is just not good enough anymore. It would be nice if life were that simple, but it really isn't in most businesses now.
Oh, yeah. Years ago, I read a book by John DeLorean, and that when they would go and build a car, they'd be looking at 10 years out. They don't have that luxury anymore, right?
Well, it's important to look ahead, but not in the sense of a plan, fixed plans. So Michael Porter is famous for saying that if you haven't made a strategy for 10 years, it's not really a strategy. And that was an accurate statement of the relatively stable period until the digital revolution, when essentially strategy was even a synonym for planning. But that's really not the case now. So you need to look outwards and ahead for the purposes of imagination and detecting, trends and signals. But the immutable plan, the big planning binder, used to be the center pillar of strategy, but it isn't anymore.
You write about blocks of inspiration. What are those things, and how do you minimize things from happening?
So introversion, we've already touched on, and you can measure this very easily, by the way. In your next meeting or your next couple of meetings, just put a line down the center of a piece of paper, and every time somebody mentions something, classified as internal or external, and you'll find that many large companies are about 95% internally oriented. So that's a block to imagination. An efficiency and execution culture where the only thing that matters is current performance and utilization and 2% improvement of efficiency over last year. If that's of course that matters, but if that's the only thing that matters, then that's a blockage to imagination. I think the single biggest one at a personal level is to confuse a mental model for a fact. So, for example, I can say I'm in the pharmaceutical industry. I have a 2.3% market share, and I'm growing by 3%. It sounds like a fact. Actually, it's a mental model. I could equally have said I'm in the health industry and I have a much smaller market share, or I could have said that on the surface I'm on the health industry, but I'm actually in the information industry and I have a 0.1% market share, and most of the potential is in markets that don't yet exist. These are all alternative mental models, but when we confuse a mental model for a fact, we don't see even the possibility of imagining. So one of the things we counsel in the book at an individual level is realize your mental models are just that, mental models. Realize that they are choices, not facts, and have alternative mental models. Get used to questioning, how am I looking at this? How am I framing this? How can I reframe this?
Well, I think entrepreneurs, beginning, because you're running out of money, you have to figure out how to pivot quickly. You have to make adjustments, and if you don't, you're out of business. I mean, I've faced that many times as an entrepreneur where I had to, I always tell clients when I write business plans for them, half this plan is wrong, and they go, "What do you mean you're writing a plan that's half wrong? I spent a lot of money with you." I said, because we don't know how everything is going to change. We went in with a basic set of assumptions that half of them are going to be wrong. It's just the way it works. And then you've got to be willing to make adjustments based on those things being wrong.
Indeed.
You mentioned the book that businesses will need to be much more knowledgeable about and competent at extracting value from unique processes in human brains. Explain that.
So going back to the motivation for the book, and another motivation for the book is the rise of AI. It's reasonable to assume that many routine activities of management will be automated away. They'll be done by machine learning algorithms in the future, and so that pushes us to focus human cognition within corporations on more uniquely human attributes. And there are three obvious ones. One of them is imagination. Machine learning cannot imagine. Another one is empathy. We prefer to deal with humans. We're a social species. And the other one is ethics. We can do something, but is it right to do that thing? That's a uniquely human thing that cannot be automated away. So I think that one of the more interesting implications of the rise of AI is that we'll have to reconceptualize what an organization means. So we might think of an organization today as a hierarchy of people with relatively fixed roles that divide a relatively unchanging overall task between them for the sake of efficiency, the division of work. But in the future, I think an organization will come to mean, to our sons and daughters, I think what an organization will mean will be a synergistic combination of humans and algorithms, which learn effectively. I won't say execute effectively, because for the reasons I explained a couple of minutes ago. So for that reason, I think algorithms are important. We have to learn to work with them. We have to focus the humans on the more uniquely human cognitive operations, and we have to figure out how to interface between the two.
So would you say that companies that have fallen by the wayside over the decades, such as Smith Corona, Sears, Blockbuster, Kodak, lost their high positions because they didn't use their imagination to recreate their business? Like they kind of just said, I don't want to screw with it. It's all working just fine, just the way it is.
Yeah, I think it's so it's this thing called strategic ambidexterity, which is, everything changes, and nowadays things change very fast because it's easy to rewire a digital business or to set up a digital competitor to a company in a very short space of time, and therefore we need to think about two tasks in business always. One of them is to run the business efficiently. We have to generate cash to pay for tomorrow. But also we have to think about how we're going to reinvent the business for tomorrow. And we do become prisoners of the assumptions underpinning our past success. And being able to think about both things is extremely difficult because it's a sort of paradox. Imagine the CEO said to you in one breath, look, follow the plan, beat your targets, don't make any mistakes, be 100% efficient, squeeze every last cent out of the plan. And then in the next breath, he said, but break the rules, be fearless, try new things, be creative. You'd probably say, well, that doesn't make sense. That's a paradox. But that is the paradox of running business today. And so these companies you referred to, yes, I think often we get sort of caricature portrayals of the failure of companies. I mean, these companies are often supplying their best efforts, populated by very talented people, but it's the depth to which they reinvent themselves. Do you change the features of the product? Do you change the product? Do you change the business model? Do you change even the market that you're competing in? I think the depth of change is much greater today to renew a business.
Yes, I think when finance people start to take over these companies, that they basically said, look, we're making fat margins on this. Let's just keep riding this out, not realizing you better start cannibalizing yourself, or somebody's going to do it for you.
Two problems with that. One of them is the so-called Seneca effect after the Roman philosopher. He observed that empires and institutions fail faster than they rise. So things can feel fine, but they can be about to collapse. And then the other one is backward-looking financial metrics. Most public companies, on the whole, measure two types of things. They measure financial outcomes and they measure productivity ratios. Both of those are essentially backward-looking. They're measuring past success. So absent forward-looking metrics, you can have the impression that things are going just fine. I believe that Kodak had one of its best years 2 years before it collapsed, and that's a very common pattern. So measuring the business in the right way and not measuring it only on backward-looking metrics of current performance, I think is very important too.
I thought what you said about Seneca was really interesting, because I studied fall of dictators, and it takes years to gain all that power. But typically, they lost it in less than a month. Like they could be in power for 25 years, and anywhere between 2 weeks and a month was typically how fast they lost everything. They had all the infrastructure, everything.
You build it very slowly, and it can be lost in an instant.
Yeah, I think I was so fascinated by that. Why don't companies ask themselves, how can we create new options, as you write in the book?
Well, I think for some reasons we've already discussed. I mean, it may seem to be an inefficient thing to do. One of the things I've studied and is reflected a little bit in the book is resilience. What is resilience? And I've looked at resilience of natural systems as well as man-made systems, biological systems, and resilience boils down to 6 essential properties. One of them is redundancy. You have buffers in case of adversity. Another one is heterogeneity or diversity. You don't have just one way of doing things, so that if your main way of doing things fails, you've got another way of doing things. Another one is modularity. You don't burn down the forest if one tree burns down, because you have a modular structure. Another one is adaptability, which is you're constantly changing and tinkering and evolving the model. Another one is prudence, which is if something could happen, then you have a plan for, what if it actually happened. And then another one is I call it embeddedness. It means don't get too out of line with the larger systems in which are embedded, society and the economy and the natural ecosystem. And the interesting thing about those 6 properties of a resilient company, and by the way, I define resilience as the ability to flourish under change, is that all of them are sort of synonyms for inefficiency, right? Redundancy. Well, that sounds awfully inefficient. The CFO probably wouldn't like that. Modularity, chop it up into small pieces, constantly change things. All of these are forms of inefficiency, but organizations that are dominated too much by efficiency thinking don't do very well in the long run.
You write about the life cycle of an idea. Can you walk us through that? And where do most companies get tripped up, where they don't put the idea into play, or they just don't execute it correctly?
Right. So I didn't call my book Creativity for Managers or Innovation for a couple of reasons. I I wanted to, I wanted not just to cover the creative spark or the individual mind component of the process. I wanted to cover the whole cycle of industrializing ideas. And I also wanted not just to deal with the things that people do, but the things that people think and do. I wanted to go inside the mind, which is another one of these areas where it's a little bit neglected in strategy. And so therefore, I looked at the entire cycle, and we divided the cycle up into 6 steps. The first one is we call the seduction, which is you're seduced by an anomaly, an observation, a surprise into imagining new possibilities. So you could call that the inspiration. The second step is we call the idea, which is what people normally think of as imagination, which is working the idea so that you go from a one-liner to something you can actually test. So that's just 1/6 of the book. That's not the whole book. And then the third stage is, we call it the collision, which is when you collide an idea with reality and you see what happens. And by the way, what's going on in that step, you're not just validating the idea. You're not just asking the question, does it work? Because most ideas fail. In the pharmaceutical industry, 9,999 ideas in 10,000 fail. In consumer goods, it's a little better, but most ideas fail. But another thing to come out of that collision is new surprises. You learn more about what might be the case, what could be the case. The fourth one is where a lot of people fall down, and it's to do with one of those myths of imagination. It's the spread of ideas. Most divisionalized companies have lots of barriers, tribal jealousies, special language, lack of network ties to the spread of ideas. If ideas don't spread, they remain private fantasies. And then the fifth stage is a very interesting stage, which we call the new normal, which is actually constructing a new reality, scaling the idea so that you get this paradoxical success, that if you're successful, your idea becomes boring because it becomes so pervasive and taken for granted. I mean, think about baking soda. Baking soda, I mean, you're probably not getting too excited about baking soda, but at the time, the idea of putting a chemical mixture you buy from a pharmacy in a cake using less eggs, and it will rise and it will stand up. It was a revolutionary idea. There was a first time that somebody did that. But if you're successful, it just becomes very, very dull, and you have to do something else. But how to codify your success is a very interesting stage. And then the last one is the hardest of all, which is we call it the encore, which is doing it not once, as most companies do. Most companies have one big success, and then they're still making vacuum cleaners 100 years later. But actually doing it multiple times, like Amazon. Amazon has been remarkable in its ability to enter one business, enter another business, not always successfully, but over time it's grown by reinventing and self-disrupting.
Microsoft has been chasing that for a long time. I mean, aside from the game industry, they really haven't been able to do what Amazon's been able to do.
Right, and it's a pure test of ambidexterity. Can you hold the trigger on your own disruption while maximizing returns from your business? That's a very paradoxical thing to do, but the greatest companies want to and are able to do that. We can actually measure it. We figured out a way of measuring our companies advantaged at running themselves and reinventing themselves, both of those things, and we found that only about 3% of companies could do that. It's a very hard but an extremely valuable thing to do. And it's interesting because ambidexterity in the sense of writing fluently with both hands, the number is also 3%. So it's ambidexterity in that sense too.
See, I mean, you were just talking about this. You write about the value of collision in terms of coming with new ideas, and use the Lego founder as an example. How can leaders train themselves and their employees, especially if they aren't creative people?
Well, I think you're making an assumption there, Mark, and obviously to some extent, perhaps some people are more creative than others, or are likely to do, better at, coming up with the next big thing than the next person. But I think the strategy of waiting for Steve Jobs and waiting for a special moment where Steve Jobs has the divine inspiration for a new business or something, it's a phenomenally bad strategy. And in any case, I believe we both have children. any 5-year-old can imagine. It's a basic human propensity. So I think it's more a question of, are leaders creating the right environment within which imagination can flourish? And almost everything we've talked about today is it's sort of somewhat cultural. So actually, we often we lazy thinking in business often attributes everything to leaders. That's bad. That doesn't work because we need more leadership. But actually, the things we're talking about today really are susceptible to the culture and the tone and the atmosphere set by leaders. Just think about it in sort of fear, complacency, extroverted attention, reflection time. These are all things where the tone is set by the leaders.
When you guys are hiring the managing partner for BCG, is that what you look for, as somebody who spurs that kind of thinking? And you're right. I mean, you don't have to be born with it, but there has to be a process in place or a culture that encourages that. Because how many times have you heard some of your own clients say, God, this isn't where ideas go to die?
Yeah. Well, I think yes. So we're a partnership. We're a very flat partnership. So it's one person, one vote, and we have multiple election rounds. And actually, we just elected a new CEO, and I think we're looking for somebody that can run the business and reinvent the business. And we're still a relatively young company. We're founded in the early '60s, and but so we've not had so many CEOs so far, because each CEO has a multi-year incumbency. But I think this has been a skill that this balance, this ambidexterity, has been something that all of our former CEOs had, and Bruce Henderson actually sort of founded the company on it. I mean, he's the guy that came up with this quote that we need to avoid becoming the prisoner of the assumptions underpinning our successful business model. He sort of feared success, and some wise entrepreneurs fear success too, because they don't want to lose the hunger and the curiosity.
100%.
So now the thing about our culture that makes it somewhat easy to do these things is that it's a very customized culture, because every client's strategy assignment is different. You can't be too cookie cutter. So therefore, we're quite a decentralized organization where individual initiative is regarded as essential. I think the bigger challenge for us is when we do come across a really good idea, and not having as one of 1,000 flowers blooming, but actually having the ability to scale and put resources to scale something. So that's what we've been doing with digital strategy. Actually, clearly clients are more and more asking problems that involve digital technology, like how to build a business ecosystem or how to digitally transform and so on. And so that was a part of the business we needed to grow very rapidly. It wasn't sufficient that we had a couple of people that had that idea, and then we had 57 other ideas too. So this ability to scale, the codify step 5 in the framework, is more of a challenge in a very individualistic or decentralized culture.
Please talk about the concept of codification and how that works and who's done that well.
So actually success is very mysterious, because failure often is due to a single factor. The computer didn't work, so the company failed. But the success requires a lot of things to go well. And if you think about scaling and replicating success, I mean, let's take a very extreme example. If you're the Four Seasons Hotel, legendary customer service, and you're opening your first branch in China with different customers, different laws, different employees, different culture. I mean, what piece of paper do you hand the employees to explain how to replicate success? It's a very tough codification problem, and most of the times it's implicit. A company has no explicit process or philosophy around codification, but we found some companies that are very good at it. One of them is actually the Lego company that you mentioned a few minutes ago. So if you think about it, building having a Star Wars ship model that could be built by a 5-year-old or a physics professor, that's a pretty tough codification problem. And so Lego regards as one of its competitive advantage this ability to communicate purely visually. It's visual instruction booklets. So they have their own language, their own philosophy about how to do that. So that's a great example of codification. In the book, we looked at one of the first, may not have been the first, but a very early example of excellent codification, which is one of the first, if not the first, fast food franchise chains, the White Castle hamburger chain.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the book. Yeah.
And it's fascinating because at the time, the idea of minced meat, fast food was considered to be a very dodgy thing. There was a lot of mistrust in food safety and processed meat products. And so the full name of the company, White Castle, I did say Hardcastle. White Castle, they called the true name of the company was the White Castle System. Why? Because they invented a system that was designed not only to produce hamburgers, but to communicate the cleanliness and nutrition of hamburgers. So why White Castle? Because they built white porcelain castles to communicate cleanliness to the customers that may have been mistrustful of these meat products. And they did 100 other things too, and it's all in a manual, and that was the franchise manual. So a wonderful example of very well thought out codification. Let me just mention one other briefly. So Apple Retail, the most successful retail format on earth in terms of dollars per square foot. How do you set up a new branch that replicates that incredible level of productivity? You can't hand people a 3,000 page manual. You've got to communicate the essence of success. So they do it with this acronym APPLE, which are the 5 stages of approaching a customer. And they take one of those letters every day in every store before the store opens, and they discuss it. And they discuss a particular example of, for instance, approaching a customer, and that's how they keep the conversation focused on what is really essential to success, which is interacting with customers in a sequential fashion, in accordance with the philosophies. We had a lot of fun with codification, and then we realized that actually we value codification too, because one of the quirky customs of the Henderson Institute is that we have a bell, a ship's bell, and we ring it every time something stunningly successful happens. For instance, the CEO calls up and says, "Could you come and spend 2 days with me? I want to discuss everything with you." That's a sort of success, right, for a strategic advisor. We ring the bell. Why do we ring the bell? Because it's a signal that we should pause and really reflect on, why did this happen? Why did the success happen? And then we try and codify and replicate that success. So being right is not good enough. You have to be right replicably because you've codified.
Were you adding on to that?
No, that was it.
Okay, all right, sounds good. How do you encourage people to share their ideas if they came from a past business culture that crushed them?
Well, I think you've got to signal that it's okay to have ideas around it. How do you do that? You model reflection time. I asked one CEO, actually a former BCG CEO, I asked him the question over dinner. I said, what was the most important part of your job that was least visible or appreciated? And without any hesitation, he said, protecting Mavericks. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there are people that have big P&Ls and big divisions and produce lots of cash. Any company celebrates them. But then there are the people that are seeing things a little bit differently, thinking ahead. And, you need those people around. Those are the people that are going to invent the future as opposed to exploit the present. And they tend to disappear in the middle of the night. They can be a bit of a pain in the butt. They're the people in the meeting that says, hang on, there's another way of looking at that when you want to move the meeting on. And he said, protecting and recognizing those people and making sure that we celebrate that role is very important. And we found a very excellent company in the book that I was actually invited to go spend a week with them. And I tried to codify their personnel system, which is based entirely around recognizing what they call entrepreneurial heroes. And so the idea of that company is that the most important thing is not running big P&Ls. That's somewhat important. The most important thing is to create the next P&L. And for that, they need to celebrate these Mavericks. They need to celebrate the birth and the development of new ideas. And they have many interesting things they do. For instance, they hold a company-wide ideas competition, and anyone that can get up on stage and has one person that wants to do their idea with them gets first round funding. And the idea is that as the head of personnel explained to me, the idea is that they call them festivals. These festivals are designed to make anyone feel that it's their obligation and also their privilege, and within the range of their abilities to start a new business, and that's the point of the company. So they're in a lot of digital businesses. So they understand the impermanence of competitive advantage in business, which is why they're totally focused on renewing themselves.
I have to say, one of the every venture I run, when people come up with new ideas, I write them up. And so when people are being recruited, we send them a list of all the ideas that come from other people in the organization, how we executed on them.
Mm-hmm.
So people know that this woman was the secretary, she came up with this idea. This one was the receptionist, this one was the janitor. And here's what we came up with. I actually had a janitor come up with an idea, made $150,000 a year.
Well, I love the example that we gave in the book of Hindustan Lever. So Hindustan Lever was the subsidiary of Unilever.
Yeah, tell that story.
Yeah, it's a marvelous story because so this was a much admired company. It was a very profitable company, a very innovative company. Everybody wanted to work for them. But we spoke with Nitin Paranjpe, who was the CEO at the time, and he's now the COO of Unilever overall. And he said, to be honest, in about 2008, we sort of hit a plateau. We were still a great company, but we were not, things were going a little stale. Things were stagnating. And so his task was to reinvigorate this very successful company. And the way he did it is he sent every employee out into the field, including the janitors and the receptionists. And they all had 5 questions. They had to answer 5 questions and come back with the answers. And we have the questions in the book. And the question number 3 is, what surprised you? And they came back with thousands of ideas. And so this company that was running out of ideas had thousands of ideas. And so they then sorted through them and put in place the revitalization program and rejuvenated the company. But it was about, going out there and looking what was wrong, what were the hidden opportunities, what did customers really think of, the company, and so on. So it comes down to, I think it's a combination of 2 things we've already spoken about. Right? One of them is external orientation and open and surprise seeking, and the other one is protecting the mavericks. Essentially, everybody in the company became a maverick. Everybody was invited to bring a surprise into the company.
One of the things you have great stories in there, by the way. The book's worth it to read just for the great stories. And one of them that I really like was the Made Informed Bra Company, about how not to get locked into an idea and being willing to make that change. Yeah. So talk about that story.
Yeah. Well, the Made Informed Bra Company is the company that invented patented the modern brassiere, and it's an example of how the world is smarter than we are. So the company was actually pursuing a program based upon the idea that it would be logical for women to want an all-in-one undergarment, all of the various things that were part of of those garments at the time. So the trusses and the hoops and the brassiere part, the all-in-one. And but they kept getting these requests for just the top component, what is now the brassiere. And fortunately, they were smart enough to say, well, screw the plan about the integrated garment. That's very logical, but that we're seeing these signals, these surprises that actually it's the exact opposite. So they refocused on just the upper portion of the garment, what became the bra, and became very successful as a result. So that's an example of where a company that was less observant and less flexible may have stuck with their fixed idea. What does the customer need? Because we've analyzed and it's logical for them to want this other thing.
How do you take advantage of anomalies? And you have some good examples in the book, but especially sometimes you think it's an anomaly and you think you can go after it, but it was maybe a one-off type of thing. So right. How do you identify those and make sure they're
this comes back to very relevant to COVID, of course, because there was a lot of discussion early in the epidemic of trends. What are the trends? And it struck me that it was the wrong question, because by the time something is a trend, it's well established, it's unambiguous, everybody else knows about it, and probably somebody else has already exploited it. So There was a stage early in COVID where you had many companies saying, hey, there's this trend towards video conferencing, that's the thing. And but it had already been exploited, and it was already like completely widely known. So you really want the nascent trends, you want the anomalies that could turn into trends. So how do you detect those? Well, you look very closely. So your enemy here is this wonderful statistical invention, the average. On average, nothing's going on, but in the particular case, there may be an exception or an anomaly. So you look at the particulars, and of course, the outlier data point could be just an outlier, or it could be a potential trend. So you look for instance, continuity over time. You look for robustness if you look at this from different angles. You think about the underlying psychology and economics, and you say, does this make sense that we're seeing this anomaly? But of course, the data, in Latin, data means that which is given. But actually, the data is not. It doesn't give you the opportunity. It just tells you that there's this anomaly. The anomaly has to be seized and proactively developed into the thing that doesn't yet exist. So a wonderful example of this, in case it sounds fanciful, is the company Brooks Automation. So Brooks Automation makes semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and they were a very successful company in that area, but they saw signs of that segment maturing, and so they were looking for. They set out to look for surprises, for anomalies, and they constructed what we call a second order patent map. To find the surprises, they looked at who was quoting their patents and who was quoting the patents that were quoting their patents. And they produced this big network diagram. And then their second question was, what's surprising about that? What don't we understand about that? And down in the right-hand corner, there was a little cluster of biotech companies or biological companies that were quoting their patents. Didn't make any sense. They made semiconductor equipment. Why were biology companies quoting their patents? They went out into the field and they saw that actually what was going on was that people were tinkering with new and better ways of handling biological materials, which were handled very primitively by the standards of the semiconductor industry. So actually they conceived, the big idea coming from this anomaly was, wow, maybe there's an industry waiting to happen here. The automated, temperature-controlled, aseptic biobanking industry, and essentially a new high-tech version of materials handling for biological materials. They went into that business, and actually, just to complete the cycle, a couple of weeks ago, it became so successful that they announced a plan to exit their previous core business, the semiconductor manufacturing business, and focus on this new business, which they'd made and shaped into a success. So that's the power of hunting surprises and anomalies.
So I thought the topic of intersubjectivity was interesting because I think it's very hard to get multiple minds to work together because of strong personalities, different views and objectives. How do you make that work?
Well, one of the fun things about writing the book was we wanted to write, I'm not sure whether you'll tell us whether we succeeded or not, but we wanted to write not just a useful book, but an interesting book, because I'm not sure whether you'd agree, but many business books are useful, but they're not that interesting. They're not that entertaining to read relative to, literature or whatever. So
that would be my books. That would be my type of, because I wrote how-to books. They're only interesting if you want to learn how to do it. But that's why I pick your book, and the books that I pick is because I find them, fascinating to read. All the stories, the research.
Our method was because it was, we couldn't have a book on imagination that was not imaginative itself. It wouldn't make any sense. And also, in order to understand imagination, we needed to look at the history, the philosophy, the arts, and so on, in addition to looking at business. So one of the most fascinating interviews we did with the book was an old man in Switzerland who was a leading philosopher of phenomenology. And he explained to us, we talked to him for hours about the problem of intersubjectivity. So intersubjectivity means I'm thinking about something. You think you're thinking about the same thing that I'm thinking about. But how would we know? Because we're dealing with an intangible idea. Perhaps we're just very empathetic and we're pretending that we understand the same thing, but we don't. And this actually arises, of course, as a very practical problem in harnessing the imagination. I've got this great idea and I explain it to you, and how do you know what it really is? You may have the feeling that you know what I'm talking about, but so how do you solve the intersubjectivity problem is critical to how do ideas spread. And there are different ways of solving it. So by exception, there are some cases where you can have such a precise language. For instance, the physics of how to make semiconductors is so precise, it's like algebra, that I can draw the diagram and the dimensions and the molecular structures. And so normally we can't do that, but sometimes we can do that. Another way is we experience together. We look at the same things together. So by sharing experience, there's a good chance that we're sharing the same thought. And another one is prototyping. So prototyping is, of course, to test whether the idea works, but it's also to produce a physical manifestation of the product, because then we don't have the intersubjectivity problem. We have an objectivity problem. We can both look at the same prototype. And actually, a little aside, when we looked at these first prototypes of ideas that changed the world, we found that they were very magical. They were very messy and very interesting objects. For instance, the first sketch of the telephone, the first prototype of the toaster, the first drawing of the Dyson cyclonic vacuum cleaner. They're all really fascinating drawings. So we actually, when the listeners can look this up, we created an online art gallery called the Napkin Gallery, because of the apocryphal stories of inventors drawing things on the back of napkins, and many of them are on napkins. We created an art gallery of these napkins online, which you can find at the imaginationmachine.org. And these are the devices that solve the intersubjectivity problem, these first sketches and these first prototypes. And I often take CEOs on a tour of the Napkin Gallery, and they're very fascinated. They say, oh yeah, wow, that's the first sketch of the computer, and that's the first computer mouse. And but then the real point of the exercise is then I ask them two questions. So the first question is, so where are your napkins? Mm-hmm. And then the second question is, well, okay, you don't know where the napkins are today, but you know your culture very well. If somebody were to produce a messy sketch that was faintly ridiculous because it wasn't steeped in the common sense of the time, of what your industry was going to look like in 10 years' time, what do you think in your culture would happen to the napkin? Would it be disposed of? Would the person be celebrated? Would you request 20 more napkins? And it always leads to a very interesting and operational discussion then about cultures of imagination and what it takes to produce them.
Let me ask you this last question, as we're running out of time here, and I greatly appreciate you being on with us today, and especially it's late over in your part of the world. What's the one thing you took away from writing this book, like you learned, that really kind of surprised you?
That's a really tough question. There are probably many answers, but my answer would be, I saw an even bigger agenda while writing the book, and maybe that's the next book, and that is, I call it the rehumanization of the corporation. So the idea is that, in some sense, the Imagination Machine, this current book, is about harnessing this unique human capacity of imagination in order to renew companies. But it's part of a wider issue of, in the context of technology, in the context of climate change, in the context of mistrust, in the context of pervasive and extreme inequalities, this human artifact, this human invention, the corporation, needs to be repurposed in some way, and we need to bring our full human capabilities and purpose to the corporation. And so that agenda for the reinvention of the corporation, which I call the rehumanization of the corporation, I'm sort of burning to do some more work and thinking about that.
Well, Martin, thank you so much. I hope you and your family of 5, I think that's what you told me, 5 kids, and your wife have a wonderful, safe holiday. I hope all of you who are listening today have a wonderful, safe holiday. And we'll look forward to that new book, because that sounds really interesting. And again, we hope 2022 is a great year for you and everybody else listening.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I enjoyed the conversation.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.